Thank you for joining us at the Evolution of Medicine Summit. A warm welcome. We wanted to make a specific thank you to our sponsors that have made this event possible. Energetics, an innovative natural remedy and supplement company, is committed to revitalizing medicine, and Cyrex Labs, a clinical immunology laboratory specializing in functional immunology and autoimmunity. Most of all, thank you for listening. If you'd like to share this with your colleagues and friends on Facebook if you enjoy the content, and if you have questions, you can ask us on Twitter with the hashtag EvoMed. Finally, if you really want to play your part in accelerating the evolution of medicine, ask your doctor if the Evolution of Medicine Summit might be right for them. Thank you and enjoy. Hello and welcome back to the Evolution of Medicine Summit. This is James Maskell, your host, and I'm very excited to have on the line today, all the way from California, Kresser on the line. Chris, welcome.
Thanks, James. Pleasure to be here.
So Chris has a very interesting story about how he got involved in this world and has really developed a great reputation amongst patients and doctors alike. I know a number of my doctor colleagues read his blog regularly at chriskresser.com. And Chris, like a lot of those doctors, you had a sort of a transformational experience with your own health that led to wanting to be active in this. For those people at home who have not come across you and your work before, would you like to share a little bit about that?
Sure, my pleasure. So growing up, I was always interested in health because I was an athlete and even then knew that, optimizing my health would help optimize my performance. But I never intended to become a healthcare practitioner or clinician. I graduated from college. I was working in television and film business for a little while. And then I decided it was always a dream of mine to travel around the world. And so I saved up some money and quit my job and sold all my possessions and took off to do that. About 9 months into that trip, I was living in a small village in Indonesia, doing some surfing, which was a major purpose of that trip. And I got the classic tropical illness that you hear about, delirium, high fever, vomiting, diarrhea. I really don't even remember much of those 3 days. And an Australian guy who was also in the village happened to have some antibiotics in his kit that he gave me, and that kind of brought me back from the brink. But as I continued to travel for a few months after that, it became clear that although the acute episode had passed, it was evolving into a really chronic, complex, and pretty debilitating illness. And it actually forced me to cut my trip a little bit short and come home to try to, find some answers. And that began a decade-long journey back to health. I went and saw doctors, initially just, my primary care doctor, who couldn't really make sense of it. And then as I dove deeper and deeper into trying to find the answer, I actually flew around the country to see top specialists. I even flew to a couple different countries. I took every kind of, all kinds of different conventional medications. I saw alternative medicine specialists of every persuasion, from doctors of Chinese medicine to homeopaths to energy healers to shamans. I had a cupboard full of supplements that didn't work that I called my supplement graveyard. I didn't leave any stone unturned, and that was partly just because that's of my nature, but it was also because I was extremely sick and I was just getting sicker and nobody could really tell me what was going on. And I just became increasingly frustrated with the medical system and what it had to offer. And so I decided at some point, as I know many people listening to this can relate to take matters into my own hands. And it became clear that nobody was more interested in me recovering my health than me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's certainly true, and there's not a lot of empowering messages out there. You say on your website that in doing this research, you described that you decided that, or found that many of the ideas and beliefs we hold about health in society are myths. Can you just, for people who may be listening who may have come across those same myths, do you have a couple or that really stand out?
Sure. I mean, one of the things that I stumbled upon pretty early was research that suggested that saturated fat isn't the evil nutrient that we've been led to believe, and the correlation between saturated fat and heart disease is very weak. And in fact, since then, some large studies have been published that have found no correlation at all. Saturated fat doesn't even necessarily increase blood cholesterol levels on average, and dietary cholesterol has no effect on blood cholesterol levels for many people. And in fact, in Europe and Japan, they've abandoned any restrictions on dietary cholesterol because the research doesn't support it. So that's a big example.
That's a great example. Were there any examples that you found that were regarding your tropical disease and how acute disease turns into chronic disease?
Absolutely. I mean, I was diagnosed, as you can imagine, with IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, which is really a diagnosis of exclusion. That means we don't know what's going on. It's not this, it's not that. So we're just going to put it in this bucket called IBS. And then they just sort of, that's it. That you've got IBS, and there are a few drugs that they prescribe, mostly analgesics and antispasmodics and drugs that are aimed at simply suppressing the symptoms of IBS. But there was no further investigation into what the causes of IBS might be. And as I looked into the scientific literature, I found that, in fact, there are numerous underlying mechanisms that can contribute to IBS, such as intestinal dysbiosis, an imbalance of good and bad bacteria, small bowel bacterial overgrowth, which is where bacteria that belongs in the colon translocates into the small intestine and overgrows there. Intestinal permeability, which we call leaky gut in the mainstream world, is another potential cause of IBS. And all of those things that I just mentioned would be expected, or certainly could be explained, by an initial gut infection, which is what I had when I was traveling. So once I saw that it wasn't just this sort of amorphous condition called IBS that has no known cause and no known treatment, and I started to investigate what the real causes of my problem might be, then that's what set me on the path of healing. And of course, that's what functional medicine is all about, getting to the root of the underlying problem and addressing it at that level instead of playing whack-a-mole with the symptoms.
Absolutely. So you've uncovered these myths, and now you're setting yourself up to actually be a practitioner. What was your decision-making process about what kind of practitioner or doctor you wanted to be from there?
Yeah, that was fascinating for me, at least. So at some point along the way, maybe by the time I was in my late 20s and I had been at it for quite a while, I decided that, people in my life were just starting to ask me to help because they had seen what I had been through and how I was able to heal myself. And I had acquired a lot of knowledge in that process, and people started to ask me for help, and I was able to help them, just in a really informal way. And so at that point, I just felt it felt like a calling. It felt like I don't believe that everything happens for a reason, but I believe that when things happen, we have a choice. We can learn from them and respond appropriately or not. And so the experience that I had really, when I reflected on it, I thought I can take this and transform it into something that can help a lot of other people. And so I decided to go back and study medicine. Initially, I was going to become an MD, and I was, had signed up for a post-bac pre-med program because I didn't do pre-med as an undergrad. And then I decided to interview 10 physicians to see what their experience was like and whether they would choose to become a physician again. And out of those 10 I interviewed, 9 advised me not to go into conventional medicine. And now keep in mind, this was a different time than today. Functional medicine was not on the scene to the degree that it is now. And a lot of the doctors I interviewed were quite conventional in their approach, and they weren't satisfied working within that system. And I also had a background of interest in nutrition, holistic medicine already at that point, and I was already somewhat distrustful of the conventional paradigm since it hadn't helped me at all. And so I was really drawn to natural medicine, and I'm a Chinese internal martial artist for many years, almost 20 years, and so I was already aware of the Chinese medicine system, and that seemed like a natural fit. Here in California, the Chinese medicine programs are very integrative. So we have all of the allopathic medicine classes, which really appealed to me, like pathophysiology, physiology, pharmacology, internal medicine, etc. But then we also had classes in botanical medicine and acupuncture, extensive education in nutrition, etc. So I decided to do that. And while I was in school, I started a blog just mainly to keep track of my own research that I was doing then. And I called it The Healthy Skeptic. And then one thing led to another, and here I am.
Yeah, it's amazing. And it seems like even at that point, even in school and doing that with The Healthy Skeptic, there was a desire already to get this information out to more people. You're very prolific and blogging and podcasting and that kind of thing. I mean, do you see that as sort of like a part of this evolution of medicine too, that this sort of democratization of this information?
Absolutely. I've been passionate about that from the start, and I think the internet's been a great enabler, and I'm really excited about all the emerging technologies that are going to make that, it's going to be even bigger sea change, especially with things like the iWatch coming out. All the effect that that's going to have is just going to raise awareness of health even more. There was a time not that long ago when people weren't able to read blogs that were analyzing the scientific research. The only people who had access to scientific research were scientists and the few doctors who stayed current with the scientific literature. Now we have a kind of army of clinicians, researchers, lay researchers who are all reading the original, the literature and interpreting it and sharing it in a really practical way. And that's what I view my role as a synthesizer, an interpreter, and someone who's able to translate these sometimes complex concepts into practical, action-oriented advice that people can follow.
Absolutely. And if you think through, what it would have taken for new research to reach medicine, all the way through the ages, you can see that has been sped up in the last sort of 5 years by maybe 100 or 1,000 fold. If you go back 20 years, you have to rely that the journals are going to provide good information. Then you have to have the doctors have to read the journals. Then the doctors have to interpret the journals and tell their patients about it one-on-one in the thing. I mean, and then it's in a 5-minute, just the opportunity for information to get out. The system is so inefficient.
Absolutely. And that's where the real transformation has come. And I think it's only going to intensify, just like the pace of technological change has intensified and sped up development in other areas of science and just life in general.
Yeah, exactly. So as you were going through medical school and Chinese medicine and becoming an acupuncturist and doing that, it's obviously pretty clear that you have some very forthright views on nutrition and what you think is good nutrition. You have your book, The Personal Paleo Code, which I know has been a great success. What is it that sort of led you down this direction? Because you could have probably written a book about Chinese medicine or, practical, that kind of thing. What is it about this that's so important to you that you chose to do this with your as the main focus of your life?
Yeah, so on a personal level, a nutrient-dense whole foods diet was what really brought me back from the 10-year struggle with illness to health. And during that time early on, I tried all kinds of different diets. It's not like I hadn't experimented at all, but I had done, a vegetarian diet, vegan, macrobiotic, a lot of what most people thought of as quote, healthy diets at that point, avoiding meat, avoiding saturated fat and cholesterol, avoiding some of the, certainly avoiding organ meats, because those things were thought of as being unhealthy.
Yeah.
And
only the British eat organ meats.
Right, exactly. Particularly if you're sick, right? Like there's in the natural medicine community, especially at that time, the macrobiotic diet was, something that you hear about it healing people with cancer and all kinds of stuff. So I was actually at one point on a macrobiotic diet and training with a local macrobiotic chef. We would cook macrobiotic meals and then go around and drop them off to people with various kinds of illnesses. So I had tried a lot of diets, but it wasn't until I discovered a paleo type of diet. I didn't even know that it was called paleo at that time, but I started eating more meat, more cholesterol, eggs, organ meats, bone broth, fermented foods, all of what we know are the most nutrient dense foods that I had been avoiding. And that's when things really turned the corner for me. So at that point, I was just doing what I had learned. I didn't know that there was this whole movement called paleo and this whole conceptual lens for looking at it. And I then met Rob Wolf, and we became friends. And then, I just really dove into the evolutionary biology and paleoanthropology literature, started to learn a lot more about the importance of a species-appropriate diet.
Absolutely, yeah. So, what's been your sort of biggest aha moments, throughout this process of understanding this? Sort of, it's not a new concept really, because in fact it's the oldest concept. But what have been some of the sort of the aha moments for you in that process?
Yeah, I think for me, the aha moment and the context and the story that really encapsulates everything that I'm talking about in terms of optimal nutrition and lifestyle is the concept of mismatch. So all organisms are adapted to survive and thrive in a particular environment. And when that environment changes faster than the organism can adapt, there's a mismatch that occurs between that organism's genes and biology and their environment. And this is really a fundamental concept in the world of evolutionary biology, and we know it applies to all animals and organisms in nature. And as much as we don't like to admit it, we're part of that. So
yeah, we've got ourselves out of the food chain, but we're still involved in the environment.
Exactly. So I think what a lot of paleo critics have pointed out, which I actually agree with, is that yes, it's true that our genes are largely the same as they were in the Paleolithic, but that doesn't mean evolution came to a full stop 10,000 years ago. There have actually been some significant genetic changes recently, and these changes do affect our tolerance of agricultural foods in some cases, and dairy would be a good example, which we can talk about if you want. But that doesn't erase the other 90% of our genes, and it doesn't mean that we're fully adapted to eat cheese doodles and ding dongs and drink super big gulps. Like those foods they're completely devoid of nutrients, and our bodies are not designed to function on those kinds of foods. So that's I think the mismatch concept is really important because it really it provides us a lens to look through. And when there's any kind of conflict in the scientific literature, or we're wondering whether something may or may not be beneficial, we can always look at it through that lens and say, is this something that humans have been doing for a long time? Is it something that is a good fit for our genes and our biology?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that's difficult when you get into these kind of conversations about mismatching is that so much has changed in the last 50 years. It's not just like small changes in the dietary patterns or otherwise. It's environmental, it's stress, it's diet, it's our interaction with microbes. All of these are causing a massive mismatch, and it seems like the plan, and this is sort of a whimsical point, I would say, but the plan has sort of been like, well, if we eat enough Twinkies, maybe we'll eventually be able to to adapt to that, but it doesn't seem like that's happening very effectively at this point.
Yeah, I'm not holding my breath for that kind of complex adaptation to occur. We might die out before that happens. But no, you're absolutely right. And that's a point that I tried to make in my book. There's 3 sections in my book, and the entire second section is all about lifestyle mismatch. So one example that few people are really aware of is the influence of artificial light. And, that's only been around for 150 years. And for 4 billion years, every single organism on Earth evolved in a way that's entrained to the natural rhythm of light and dark on this planet. And that natural rhythm of light and dark affects literally every single cell in our body. And all of a sudden, relatively recently, we're now living in a situation where we can be exposed to bright light at any time of day. And that affects our brain, and it affects every cell in our body. And so we're kind of performing this huge society-wide experiment. And so far, the results are not promising. We know that too much exposure to light at night can suppress melatonin. And melatonin is the hormone that helps us to not only to fall asleep and stay asleep, but it has several other really important properties, including chemoprotective, cancer protective role. And so you see in flight attendants and shift workers and people whose chrono system is disrupted, you see much higher rates of cancer because of this. So, I mean, that's just one tiny example. Another is that many people now sit for maybe 10, 12, even up to 16 hours a day. You know, if you imagine a typical office worker who commutes an hour in the car, they get up, they get in the car, they sit, they get to work, they sit all day, they drive home sitting, they eat dinner sitting, then they go to the couch and watch 2 or 3 hours of TV, more sitting. That's completely anomalous from an evolutionary perspective. And even just, 60, 75, 100 years ago in the industrialized world, manual labor was much more common than it is now, and people did not sit for 16 hours a day. And, the research is showing us that sitting is profoundly harmful, even if you're getting enough exercise. So you could be getting 150 minutes a week of moderate intensity activity, which is what the government recommends. And if you're sitting most of the rest of the time, you're still going to be at increased risk of disease and death. So those are two examples. There are many more. And I think those have just as big of an impact on our health as what we eat.
Yeah. And I think as a scientist, which, most people probably think themselves as, it's kind of a fun idea to think about, well, what is actually happening here, what's causing what, and so forth. But just given how many different changes have happened in such a short period of time, we could spend so much time working out what's causing what and not really doing anything to solve the problem, which is obviously, needing to take corrective action to this. So, even those two examples, it would be difficult to find, because most of the people who are sitting all the time are also living in in a non-typical light environment, or a non-evolutionary typical light environment, right?
Yeah, exactly. Nothing happens in a vacuum. It's always multifactorial. There are multiple things that are influencing our health, and some that's not even a matter of circumstances. It's more a matter of how we're relating to those circumstances and our attitudes and beliefs. So it's very it gets pretty complex, but actually, I think that can be a little bit of a distraction. And when you look at it, at what needs to change, it really becomes quite simple. It's that we need to embrace the principles of a species-appropriate diet and lifestyle. And the reason I put it that way is, I'm not suggesting we go back to like Paleolithic living. That's not going to happen, and it's not even desirable for most people. You don't have to wear a loincloth or sleep out in the backyard to get the benefits of this. And let's just take the two examples I use. So sitting most of the day, a lot of people have a job where they work in an office and they have to sit. But there are many things you can do to mitigate that. So one, you can ask your boss if you can get a standing desk. That's becoming more and more common, and I think it will be even more common when employers figure out that it's going to save them millions of dollars a year in healthcare costs and actually make them more money, because their employees will be happier and more productive. And there's research to support that. But you can do that. If you drive to work, you can park maybe a mile or two away from the office and walk the remainder. So you get a little bit of exercise that way. Same with public transport. You can overshoot or undershoot your stop. If you live close enough to walk or bicycle to work, you can do that. You can get software application on your computer now that reminds you to take a break at specified intervals. So there's a study that showed that taking even just a 2-minute standing walking break every 50 minutes significantly mitigated the harmful effects of sitting all day. So there are a number of little interventions that you can do that can reflect the principles that we're talking about here, without, changing dramatically your existing life. And in the case of artificial light, what that might look like is just instead of sitting in bed at 11:30 p.m. with your iPad, which is emitting this blue light that's suppressing melatonin, you restrict your use of those devices to maybe, you don't use them a couple hours before you fall asleep. Or even if that's not possible, there are these orange tinted glasses that you can buy very cheaply on Amazon and elsewhere that filter out the wavelengths of light that suppress melatonin. So you can put these glasses on after the sun goes down, and if you're exposed to any screens, it's going to help, it's going to make it so that melatonin doesn't interfere with or the light doesn't interfere with your melatonin production, and you'll sleep much better and generally feel much better.
Yeah. Well, actually, one of the things that I saw actually was some research recently about camping, and that camping was an unbelievably healthy thing to do because, one, there was no artificial light, and a few days camping, you get your circadian rhythm back. Obviously, being in nature, all the microbiome improvements of being in a microbe-rich environment, never mind the stress, never mind, those kind of things. So, that's sort of like a little halfway house as well.
Yeah, was this the study that showed that camping reset the circadian clock in kids who had ADHD and
Exactly.
Yeah, that was a great study.
Yeah, so it seems like there's a lot of interesting and easy ways for people to be able to do that. I think those are two great examples because those are two things that have not really been spoken about that much. I've certainly heard about. We had another one of your paleo colleagues, Dr. Jeff Glad, speak at one of our events earlier in the year, and when our event was sold out and people had to stand at the back, he was like, "Lucky for you guys, because sitting's the new smoking."
That's right. We're doing you a favor.
Yeah. So that's great, and I appreciate that. So in your book and so forth, you sort of argue that the nutritional concepts that are argued by paleo need a little bit of updating, given the fact that in the last 10,000 years we have adapted more to our environment. So for those people who are listening, what would you say is sort of like the basic principles of what you would consider would be a healthy nutrition? Because this day is all about the evolution of nutrition, and paleo is certainly an evolutionary concept. In fact, before you get into what you think is the best, can you just maybe knock down some myths of paleo? Because I know a lot of people see paleo as sort of like the Atkins diet, where you're just eating sausages for every meal. That's not quite true, is it?
No, it's not at all. I mean, I tell people paleo is a plant-based diet that happens to include some meat and animal products, but it's essentially 2/3 plants. When you look at a paleo plate, it might include a bunch of non-starchy vegetables, possibly some starchy vegetables like a sweet potato, maybe not at the same meal, but some nuts and seeds or some fruit. And then you've got a serving of animal protein, typically, whether that's eggs or meat or fish. But the majority of what you see on the plate is going to be plants. And people who switch to paleo from like a standard American diet end up eating a much higher percentage of plants in their day-to-day life than they were before, and their intake of meat may stay about the same. Maybe it goes up a little bit, but their intake of plants typically skyrockets. So that's definitely a myth about paleo.
Is that a game changer? The plant percentages, in your experience, is a game changer? Because it seems like that's the major benefit of when people go vegetarian, is now suddenly they have to work out how to make stuff with plants. Seems that's like right. Adding more plants is like the baseline value.
I think that's important, but I also think that the nutrient density of paleo is what is the game changer. And, I actually use, these days more and more when I talk about paleo, I might briefly mention the evolutionary lens because I think it's important, and I think humans learn through storytelling primarily, and that's a great story to tell that contextualizes the whole approach, and people really resonate with it. But increasingly, I like to explain the benefits of paleo from a modern scientific perspective. And when you look at it, paleo works very, very well because it's nutrient dense and it's anti-inflammatory and it's very satiating. And we can talk about each of those in a little more detail. But basically, nutrient density is one of the most important things to evaluate when you're looking at a particular diet, because our body, that's the fuel for our body. We need over 40 micronutrients to function properly. And if we have a suboptimal intake of any of those nutrients, our bodies aren't going to work well. We don't die usually. That has to be extreme. But we just feel lousy like many people do. And 50% of Americans are deficient in several key nutrients. And that's deficiency defined according to the RDA. Which is the amount that has been shown to cause acute deficiency symptoms, like serious deficiency symptoms.
Like scurvy.
Exactly, like scurvy or rickets.
Yeah.
So the RDA is probably woefully inadequate for most of the nutrients, and yet still more than 50% of Americans are deficient in many of the key vitamins and minerals that we need. So paleo is very nutrient dense. So you look at a chart that labels the nutrient density of foods. Many people are shocked to see that organ meats are consistently at the top of the list. And we're talking about the micronutrients we know that we absolutely need to function, the vitamins, minerals, trace minerals, et cetera. We're not talking right now about all of the phytonutrients that also play an important role, but that aren't absolutely essential. So you see organ meats at the top, you see seafood and shellfish are very high, meat, other kind of meat, particularly red meat, eggs, nuts and seeds, herbs and spices, dark chocolate. A lot of people will be happy to hear, extremely nutrient dense. Yep. So what have I just described? I've basically just described a paleo diet. And so nutrient density is one of the main reasons from a modern scientific perspective that we choose this. And I can't tell you how many patients I have that, and of course my own experience reflects this as well, we're eating a plant-based vegetarian or vegan diet and developed tons of nutrient deficiencies. And that's partly because, plants have a lot of fantastic nutrients. They should always be a big part of our diet, as they are in paleo diet. But animal products are the most bioavailable source of protein and several different vitamins and minerals that are really difficult to get through plant foods alone. So I think that's a really important concept for people to understand.
Yeah, and I know you're also a big fan of the bone broth. That's been something that my parents were into it, and we've always done it. It seems like, that's certainly an evolutionary food. I mean, if you think what the cavemen were making, they were making some sort of stew broth type of thing.
Yeah,
right?
And they were also eating all the different parts of the animal. In fact, in many traditional cultures, they would throw the muscle meat to the dogs. The parts that we eat preferentially now were the least desirable to them. And when you look at nutrient density studies, you understand why. I mean, they didn't know that, of course. They just knew through experience. But the organ meats and the tougher cuts of meat, like brisket and shanks and oxtail, they have nutrients that turn out to be complementary to the nutrients that are in the leaner muscle meats. And if you eat too much lean muscle meat without eating these other nutrients, you can develop some imbalances. And in fact, some of the studies that have shown that higher intakes of animal protein can, increase the risk of cancer. Basically, it's not animal protein itself. It's too much lean animal protein without enough of these other supportive nutrients. So this is again where the evolutionary lens helps us to understand what choices we make today, and how we might look back and learn from our ancestors to create a healthier diet today.
That's so interesting. I never thought I'd tell this story on the Evolution of Medicine Summit when I started out, but when I was 5 years old, I was in West Africa with my parents, and exactly that happened, where they sacrificed a cow to my parents for being there. They cut it up, and then basically my dad was presented with the liver and said this was the greatest joy or the greatest thing that they could provide. Big green throbbing thing, not adjusted to the palate of a Westerner, but that was their greatest gift that they could offer. And it's very interesting that you say that, because I hadn't really thought about that until recently. But there's certainly a lot of wisdom in those cultures that have been around for a long time.
Yeah. That's an amazing story, and it's so true. I mean, and liver is really the most nutrient-dense food on the planet when you look at it from the perspective of essential nutrients we need. So the second reason that paleo makes sense, I think, is because it's anti-inflammatory. So a lot of the foods that are contributing to this modern disease epidemic of chronic inflammatory conditions like obesity, diabetes, heart disease, allergies, asthma, autoimmune disease, etc. Diseases which, by the way, were not even really present significantly in the industrialized world up until about 150 years ago. So these are not inevitable result of being human. These are modern diseases caused by our modern diet and lifestyle. And foods like refined flour, refined sugar, industrial seed oils, all kinds of processed and refined ingredients are provoking inflammation in our body, and that's what's leading to this disease epidemic. So the foods on paleo are foods that humans have been eating for a very, very long time. We're well adapted to them. Our bodies know what to do with them, how to extract nutrients from them. They're the least likely to cause food intolerances and allergic type of reactions. I mean, when's the last time you heard someone say they have a blueberry intolerance or a sweet potato intolerance?
Yeah.
I mean, they might not like those foods, but whereas you look at foods like, gluten-containing grains, lots of people gluten intolerant, dairy products, lots of people are intolerant of dairy, and that's because these foods have not been around as long, and they're more likely to cause problems. Doesn't mean they do for everybody, but they're more likely to. So I recommend starting with a paleo approach, at least for a period of time, because it's the best way to hit the reset button, reduce inflammation. And then at the end of that period, you can add back in some of these gray area agricultural foods like dairy or grains or legumes, which may be healthy when they're well tolerated. But you first have to figure out, find out how you do without them. And add them back in. That's my argument in my book.
So if there are people who are listening to this who are sick right now and are looking for new options, it's best to go sort of all the way for a period of time and remove all those kind of things. Do you feel like this stricter paleo that you're talking about is the best diet to be having when you're recovering from a chronic disease?
It's the best one that I've discovered. So a paleo diet plus bone broth plus fermented foods, plenty of fermentable fibers, making sure you're getting enough cold water fatty fish for the EPA and DHA, and perhaps some sea vegetables for iodine and trace minerals. That's absolutely loaded with all of the nutrients that humans need to function well, and it removes a lot of the foods that cause problems in people with chronic illnesses. So grains and legumes, I disagree with some other paleo people on this. I do not think that whole grains and legumes have been significant contributors to the modern disease epidemic. I think that's kind of a preposterous argument, and that cannot be supported by scientific evidence. But I can tell you, as a clinician that works with sick people, that a lot of people with an inflamed gut, which is an increasingly large percentage of the population, don't do that well with grains and legumes. Possibly because of the fibers that they contain can be irritating to an inflamed gut, and they feel better removing them until their gut heals and until they heal and get better overall. And then at that point, they can reintroduce some of those foods if they wish. But when they do, those foods should be prepared in such a way that makes them more absorbable and digestible. And this is yet another example of where traditional wisdom comes in. Every culture that ate grains and legumes soaked them, fermented them, sprouted them. They prepared them in such a way that unlocks the nutrients in them and makes them easier to absorb and digest. So we can once again learn from them.
Yeah, so it's amazing actually how that is essentially a scientific understanding. What they're doing is using different strategies to try things out, seeing how they work, and then iterating on those processes. We seem to have lost a little bit of that in the last little while by sort of abdicating to this third party sort of mainstream science. Do you feel like that's a loss to us, or do you think there's been a net gain?
I do. I think that perspective has not been a big part of any kind of medicine, whether conventional, certainly more in the alternative world, that there's been more of a through line there historically. But increasingly, we're starting to see that our grandparents and perhaps great-grandparents really actually were probably doing things a lot closer to how we should be doing them. And one of the unfortunate things about progress, and at least how it's viewed in the modern world, is that anything that's old is inferior. And of course, we know that that's not true, but it sometimes requires a little bit of reminding of ourselves and our patients, perhaps, to make that clear. For me, as a clinician, there's a kind of, I think of, if I evaluate everything that I recommend to my patients through like we can call it a three-legged stool. So one is modern clinical evidence, randomized trials and epidemiological evidence, all the stuff we can look up in PubMed. Does it check out based on that? Two is my clinical experience. Like, how does this stuff actually work in the real world? Because there are all kinds of ideas that sound great on paper. When you try them with patients, they fail miserably. And I know any clinician who's listening to this has had that experience. And 3 would be traditional wisdom or evolutionary biology. So does this make sense from an evolutionary perspective? And I find that if you evaluate approaches or diets or any kind of therapeutic intervention through those 3 different lenses, and it checks out on all 3, it's far, far more likely to be effective and safe.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's some stuff that I want to get into just on that topic that I think is maybe, I don't know if you've spoken about this before, but it seems to me that there's a lot of evolutionary concepts in medicine that are sort of coming back on vogue now. So like the microbiome is a huge one where we're realizing that we've co-evolved with these microbes and we need to honor that relationship. And then recently, as a result of reading Jeff Bland's book, I came across the fact that it's sort of widely accepted that mitochondria were adapted from bacteria and
Yes.
that was part of it. And so, maybe we could just talk about this for a minute, because I think you're exactly the right person to speak to, because I know that you like to geek out about this kind of stuff, but also I know that you're interested in evolutionary stuff. My feeling is that, the just from reading that is that because it evolved, because mitochondria is so important in the cell, and they, it's an important part of why we became human, maybe from single-celled organisms, that, the chronic diseases that we're seeing now all involve, sort of an effect on the mitochondria, and maybe because of its bacterial origins, some of the interventions that we've been using in modern medicine may have been having a sort of a slow but now noticeable effect on that.
I think that's a reasonable hypothesis. And, even on a simpler level, as you pointed out, the microbiome is now one of the hottest topics in the research literature and just even in the medical world overall. And the reason for that, I really truly think that if the 20th century was about understanding how microbes cause disease, and that was maybe the most profound advance in medicine, the 21st century is going to be about learning how microbes contribute to health and learning how to manipulate the microbiome in ways that, promote health rather than destroy it. And it's hard to even express the importance of this. You know this, James, but there are every single chronic inflammatory disease that you can think of, there are studies connecting it to disruptions in the microbiome. And I think that the probably single biggest thing that people can do to improve their health and longevity is to address their microbiome. And of course, that will involve diet. It will involve sleep. It will involve stress management. It will involve all of the other things that we've been discussing. But it's another way of looking at things. And it's another way of evaluating whether this or that particular diet or intervention is a good idea. So I don't think we can say enough about that.
No, I completely agree. And when I started to understand a little bit more about this and see that, it just certainly seemed like this was, again, it's sort of an empowering message as well, because it feels like there's not, short of everyone having a fecal transplant, there's not going to be like a medical intervention that's going to help you improve your microbiome. A lot of it is under our control all the time with what we eat and whether we're in nature and so forth. What I've seen from the new literature of the new testing like uBiome and some of the kits that are coming out is that having a pet or being in nature seems to be almost way, as effective as or more effective as things like probiotic supplementation.
Yeah, so that's a great point. It's kind of, we can make both arguments, because you probably saw this new study that showed that you can alter your microbiome in just one day from dietary changes. Wow. And, it may not be a long-lasting alteration, but, we're talking about rapid changes relatively rapidly. There were 2 groups of people in the study. One ate exclusively animal products, no plant products at all. And the other group ate a plant-based diet. And then they did some crossover where they switched the people over from one group to the next, and they found remarkable changes in the gut microbiota, even in 3 days of doing that. So certainly diet can have an effect, and we're learning more and more about how to use diet wisely to foster a healthy microbiome. But as you pointed out, there are many other things that have significant impact and maybe even greater impact. Certainly antibiotics are a big player. We know that a single 7-day course of clindamycin can alter the gut microbiome for up to 2 years. I just read a study about that. And Dr. Blazer's new book that just came out called Missing Microbes has some pretty frightening statistics in there. I think the average 2-year-old has already taken 3 or 4 courses of antibiotics. And by the time we're 30, the average person has taken 40 courses of antibiotics over their lifetime. So this is really profound. This is essentially, we've driven the normal human microbiome into a state of extinction. There's only one population really in the world now, the Hadza, that have something that probably resembles the ancestral human microbiome. And everywhere else, we've basically obliterated it and, changed it beyond recognition. And so if you realize that there are 100 trillion bacterial microbiological cells in the gut and only 10 trillion human cells in the body, and there's much more bacterial DNA in our gut than there is human DNA. In a way, we're more bacterial than we are human, and we're kind of stewards for this microbiome, this gut biome that we harbor that contributes to our health and to disease. And we are at a point now in the modern world where we've almost lost touch with what it means to even have a natural microbiome. And I know there are researchers like Jeff Leach, I think, who's in Africa right now, culturing or taking samples of the Hadza hunter-gatherer biome so that we even have an idea what it's supposed to look like. So that's some of the bad news. The good news is we're learning a lot more about how to address it. As you pointed out, just simple things like having a pet, spending time in nature, eating plenty of fermentable fibers that feed the beneficial gut bacteria, which seems to be even more important than probiotics, foods that have a prebiotic effect, getting enough sleep, managing our stress. These are all things that everybody can do to protect their gut and their gut biome.
That's spot on. So I know you've been very interested in within the paleo community of talking about sort of the evolution of paleo. So, in your book, you talk about how we've gone to a situation where maybe we can have dairy because we've evolved in the last 10,000 years to it. Do you see that the paleo movement, which is becoming pretty significant and, quite forceful, do you think the paleo movement is a good vehicle to move the conversation forward about the microbiome and the importance? Because it looks like, we might be just even in the next few years doing some damage that we're not going to walk away from potentially.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, I think it's a powerful meme. Like I said before, it's a story that resonates with people, and that's the way that ideas advance most rapidly in human culture. It also encourages people to eat a lot more plants, despite the popular critiques of paleo, which claim it's all meat-based diet. And plants are the things that where the fermentable fibers are found that feed our beneficial gut bacteria. Also, just the nature of paleo and looking through the ancestral lens, it's natural to, a lot of people get exposed to this concept of the microbiome and how important it is to health. People like me in the paleo world are writing about it. And it just makes sense to them when they've already learned to see through the evolutionary lens. So I think it can definitely be a good vehicle. To be perfectly honest, paleo for me is just a convenient term that describes the whole approach to diet and lifestyle that I advocate in one word. And I would be perfectly fine with that word going away and adopting another term in the future. I'm not married at all to paleo per se, but I'm a big believer in what it represents. And that's why I called my book Personal Paleo Code, because I look at paleo as a starting place or a template rather than a rigid diet that you follow for the rest of your life. And that's, hopefully have had some impact on that conversation and moving that forward, because I think looking at paleo as a rigid diet is not only inaccurate scientifically, because we can't know what our ancestors ate with certainty, and certainly there was huge variation in what people ate depending on where they were, but it's also extremely limiting, and it will never penetrate at the level that needs to happen to have a really global sea change in our health.
Yeah, absolutely. If it always remains a fad, then it will never be sort of taken seriously and
Exactly.
do that. Yeah, I see that for sure. So let's, I'd love to just spend the last little while here talking about, sort of our adaptation to medicine, or the evolution of medicine in the context of, the next stage of the human evolution, which is our interaction with computers and technology. Because right there in San Francisco, where you have Singularity University, where we're all going to be like half human, half computer cyborgs, and maybe we're not going to go in that direction. But
yeah.
what are when we talk about the evolution of medicine and we look down the corridor of the next few years, where essentially patients are going to have a lot more information to them, it seems to me that it's going to be just only a natural thing that once you can get all of this upstream information to your iWatch or whatever it might be, that these kind of functional concepts where you're building on the underlying function rather than waiting for the manifestation of the symptoms, it just seems like that'll just be obvious, right?
Yeah, I think so. And as I said before, I'm super excited about this. I think it's going to create a revolution, not just in how we access data and interact with our healthcare practitioners, but just I think the biggest positive effect this will have is just increasing awareness of health. A lot more people are going to be thinking about health because of these technologies, and only good can come of that. However, at the risk of sounding a bit like a neo-Luddite, I think there is a potential dark side to these technologies, and I know people have seen this in their own lives. Technology can be addictive. I'm often working with my patients to get them to step away from their phone and their iPad and all of their technologies for at least a period of time, because in some cases people have gotten to a point where it's relatively impossible for them to spend even a few moments without interacting with some kind of screen. And I think that's changing our brain in potentially serious ways, and changing the way we think, changing the way we interact with others, changing the way we relate to ourselves, changing our basic experience of the world around us, which is at the most fundamental level what it means to be human. So I think the technology has tremendous potential, but I think it's a double-edged sword. It needs to be used wisely, and increasingly I'm seeing a need to work with people on stepping away from it rather than toward it, because for example, I recently started doing a digital detox at 1 day a week where I don't interact at all with my phone or email or technology, anything at all. I just have a day of that, and then I do periodically. I just went on vacation recently, and I did a 10-day digital detox where I didn't have any interaction, and it was profound. It had a major, major effect on me. And
I'd love to hear about that, because I feel like I probably need to do one, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. So was there like the typical addict's first few days where you sort of feel like you're missing something?
I didn't have that as much. Some people do, but I've been a meditator for maybe 20, 25 years almost now. And so it was pretty natural for me to get back to a place where I was just more present with my surroundings and my environment. I did have a little bit of that for sure in the beginning, but it went away pretty quickly. And I'll tell you, the harder part for me was coming back. At the end of that 10 days, I felt like, maybe I should just move to Nicaragua and farm coconuts or something for a living, because it was very difficult to pick up check my email and get back into the whole swing, because I felt this sort of almost like a pit in my stomach. It was like I knew where that was going to take me, and I love my work. So this is like a best case scenario, thing to get back to. But that really hit home for me, and it really actually forced me to make or invited me to make changes in my life when I got back from that trip. And that's when I instituted the policy of doing that once a week. I started carving out more time in my schedule to just be completely away from technology. I'm fortunate to live on the border of a regional park, so I've been making sure to take more walks in the woods. And I think this is going to become even more important as technology just is more and more integrated into our lives in a seamless way. And we need to make sure we're setting aside time where we can just be present with our feet connected to the ground and not interacting with some kind of technology.
Absolutely. Well, I really appreciate you sharing that. I think that's good information. I mean, you're probably on the sort of the cutting edge of that, and I'd imagine that we'll see a lot more of that. And I would imagine that part of this evolution of medicine is to be able to get the good without the bad, which is to, maybe find ways to track this information without necessarily having to be engaged with it all the time and then following it. And so it's not such a, it's not so screen dominant, but again, that sounds a little bit more like a cyborg. So we'll have to see which way it goes.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because this is my whole argument is like, why not you combine the benefits, what we can learn from a paleo-based diet and lifestyle in the ancestral lands, with the best that modern medicine and technology has to offer. And as long as you keep thinking in both of those terms on parallel track, that can save us from going too far into technology, and getting just completely lost in that, because that's not a good path, and at least I don't think it is.
Yeah.
And you talk about a mismatch. I mean, there's never been a time in history where humans didn't have at least some time to just be with themselves, their own thoughts, their own sensations in a natural kind of environment. Ever. Never, ever in history has there been a time. And I think with all the increase in behavioral diseases in kids, attention deficit disorder, all of that stuff is really a reflection of this change that we've seen in society recently.
Absolutely. Well, Chris, I really appreciate everything that you've shared today. Throughout this summit, I've given every speaker an opportunity to just sort of share with, when I say the words, the evolution of medicine, what does that really, conjure up for you? I mean, we've spoken about this all through the whole hour, but is there one particular sort of nugget or thought or feeling that comes up when you hear those three words?
I think to me, it is essentially what I just mentioned. It's a moving forward in terms of empowering people to take more charge of their own health. So, a move away from the hierarchical top-down model where doctors and researchers have all the answers and the patient just shows up and takes the medication that's prescribed, to a point where the patient is really the center of their own healthcare. And certainly they rely on doctors and other practitioners for guidance and help and their judgment, but it's really patient-driven, and all of the care that's offered is patient-driven and patient-centered, and the new technologies are going to help make that possible. At the same time, I think the evolution of medicine involves paying more attention to evolution, and this is why evolutionary biology has become such a popular discipline, and we cannot separate ourselves from our past. We are living animals. We are subject to the same forces and limitations that other animals and organisms are in nature. And I think we got a little arrogant in our technological progress and assumed that those rules don't apply, and we suffered the consequences. And now I see a big movement back to respecting our evolutionary heritage and incorporating that into our approach.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Well, Chris, you've been extremely eloquent today. I really appreciate your work. For those people who are listening, I definitely recommend the Personal Paleo Code. I know you've done other books to do with kids and so forth that have been valuable to a number of people that I know and also myself. Chris Kresser is the website to check out what Chris is doing. I really appreciate your time on the summit, Chris, and I really appreciate your role in sort of articulating the evolution of medicine. And I know that you're just getting started too, so we'll look forward to seeing a lot more of you in the coming years.
Well, thanks a lot, James. I appreciate the opportunity, and I enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, me too. This is the Evolution of Medicine Summit. This is the Evolution of Nutrition Day. This has been Chris Kresser. This is your host, James Maskell, and we'll see you next time.